Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, what an honor it is to welcome you all to Standard Bank's second inaugural Climate Summit, a partnership with the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies. I'm Alicia Seckham, and after last year's, as I said, inaugural event, which was held virtually, of course, it really is wonderful to see so many of you attending this year's summit in person. We have an additional element to today's event as well. We are broadcasting live on CNBC Africa, so welcome to our CNBC Africa viewers this morning as well. Ladies and gentlemen, because this is a live broadcast and an in-person event, a few housekeeping rules. Please can I ask you to turn all devices to silent to avoid any interruptions to the conversations we'll be having today. But having said that, please can I encourage you to make use of your devices to keep the conversations going on social media. And for that, you can use the hashtag SBG Climate Change Summit. Just a note, most of the updates will be coming through on the Standard Bank Corporate and Investment Banking LinkedIn page. Right, let's get straight into things now. So without any further ado, I'd like to at this point introduce Kenny Fihla. He's Standard Bank's Chief Executive for Corporate and Investment Banking, to more officially welcome all of you and to really kick off this year's summit.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I mean, after that very vibrant set of remarks, I guess you'll have to listen to me do the official welcome. Minister Creecy, Ms. Nyembezi, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second annual Standard Bank Climate Summit, hosted in partnership with the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. Today, we have the pleasure of being in the company of some of Africa's foremost sustainability specialists from both the public and private sectors, and delegates from here in South Africa, all the way through the Horn of Africa to Nigeria, the DRC, the United States, and Europe. We are all bound together by the common purpose of finding Africa's solutions to African challenges. I want to thank senior government officials, business leaders, investors, Standard Bank board members, academia, the media, our employees, and all those present today, both in person and virtually, for gracing this conference with your attendance. Without all your participation, this summit will not be possible. The issue we'll be discussing today are an existential threat to all of humankind and therefore require collective solutions for the social, economic, and environmental prosperity of the world. As the proverb goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Indeed, we intend to go further together to seek solutions to some of these big challenges that are confronting us today. This year's Climate Summit builds on last year's theme, Africa's journey to net zero. The summit provides a platform for various voices from across different parts of society to deliberate on how we can mitigate the effects of climate change in a manner that expands access to energy while still developing Africa's economies for the betterment of her people. Further, it considers how to attract suitable investment and how strong public-private partnerships should be at the core of this delicate balancing act. With COP27 being hosted in Africa next month, this summit presents a unique opportunity to contribute to our collective voice for a just energy transition and the advocacy for Africa's well-being. I am sure we're all eager to start. And so let me hand back to Alicia to help us get going with our program. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kenny, for that warm welcome, and how right you are that climate change discussions are never easy. And I'd like to now welcome to the podium Ms. Barbara Creecy, Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries of the Republic of South Africa, with our opening keynote address for today.
Thank you very much, Alicia, Ms. Nyembezi, Mr. Fiedler. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And I thought, as you've heard, I would just give you an overview of how in government we understand the problem and the risks that we're facing, what we're doing about those risks, the architecture that we're putting in place in relation to the Paris Agreement, and then speak a little bit about the just energy transition process and the investment plan and what we think that you can do to help us. So just by way of beginning, let's look at the science. What is the science telling us? The science is telling us that we are already living through climate change. The average global temperature has already warmed by 1.1 degree above pre-industrial times. And here in sub-Saharan Africa, where we live, the average global temperature has already warmed by double the global rate at 2.2 degrees centigrade. And this poses two risks. On the one hand, it poses what we call a climate risk. And I think that we've lived through the drought in the Western Cape. We are still living through the drought in parts of the Eastern Cape. Earlier this year, we experienced the floods in KZN. Everybody knows what we're talking about when we talk about the physical risk that climate change poses to human beings and to the economy. But equally important is what we call the transition risk. And you would understand that all of our major global trading partners have committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And what this means is that there is a major investment occurring across the globe in new green technologies, which is beginning to fundamentally change the production process in all countries. I did have the opportunity earlier this year to attend the climate summit in Berlin, and I've just returned from the pre-COP meeting in Kinshasa. And one of the questions I was curious to ask the developed countries in the light of the Ukraine war and the energy crisis that developed countries, particularly Europe, is facing this winter is, what impact is this having on the transition risk for our country? And what was interesting is that the European Union itself and many of the other players in Europe said to me, look, this winter is going to be tough. In certain domains, we will be reopening our coal-fired power stations. We're talking about up to 5% energy coming from coal. But this is a short-term intervention, and if anything, the transition has the threat that the energy insecurity of the Ukraine war has posed for us is that we're going to accelerate the transition. And very interestingly, they were saying that given their reliance on Russian gas, they will be accelerating beyond gas as a transition fuel, and they will be looking at green hydrogen as their new transition fuel. Now, we are signatories to the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement requires us to do three things. It requires us to set a temperature goal for the country, and in our National Development Plan, we have committed to a mid-century net zero platform. But we also submitted significantly revised nationally determined contribution to reducing greenhouse gases at COP26 last year. Our temperature goal is in a range. The upper end of the range is compatible with the 2-degree global temperature average increase, and the bottom end of the range is compatible with what scientists are advising us is the preferable goal, which is the 1.5 global average temperature increase. What the Paris Agreement also requires countries to develop is what they call a resilience goal, or what we call adaptation to the reality of living with climate change. And lastly, a finance goal. What we are required to do is to commit to finding domestic means of implementing our climate goals. Now, we have already put in place a significant architecture to start to meet these climate commitments, and I think that what we're very sincerely hoping is that that would create appetite from the private sector and would begin to mobilize the significant quantities of financing that we're going to need over the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure at this point to welcome His Excellency Dr. Okube, who's Senior Minister and Professor of Practice at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and he's going to be framing this very important discussion.
Thank you, Alicia. And I would like to build on what Minister Creecy and Chief Executive Mr. Killer mentioned. First, let me thank Standard Bank and SOAS University of London and all partners in organizing this climate summit. I'm very honored to share my perspectives on Africa's journey to net zero with a particular context on the energy transition. Energy is central because from the global gas emission, 75% is accounted by energy, because energy is input in all processes, and it's a very critical component. I would like to highlight three important perspectives to guide our discussion. The first one is we need to start from the bigger picture, the global perspective on net zero, and the key element is the net zero vision and ambition is going to be the biggest transformation of the century. It's an existential crisis. It's also that determines the future as well, future trajectory, and it also requires collective action. So what we observe, some of the progress is that the net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050 is now pulling traction. 140 countries have signed and pledged to meet this requirement. But the important dilemma or obstacle is there is no consensus on how to achieve it, and there is unevenness and lagging action in making things happen. So this should be a starting point. Then the way forward is that first, the status quo is a dead end, and there is no way we can proceed or pursue the current paradigm. Degrowth is not also an answer because it doesn't meet the requirement of developing countries as well as advanced economies who need to restructure their economy. The pursuit of sustained economic development and decarbonization is the one that's going to be the virtuous cycle that will help us to achieve the net zero goals. Here there are two important foundations or strategies. The first one is This is about green industrial revolution. It's about greening of economic development, which requires a paradigm shift. It's about changing the techno-economic systems, social structures, political system, even the global order. So this is one aspect we need to consider. A second aspect is the achievement of net zero can only be achieved with the just transition strategy, which is based on polluter-pays principle, based on cumulative carbon emission. This requires a common action, but also differentiated responsibility. And to be specific, the $100 billion annual pledge made at Copenhagen Climate Summit needs to be implemented. And also, developing countries must be able to have better access to technology, because without technological capability, we are not going to achieve what we need. And one thing we need to remember, despite the denial of climate change, despite the inaction, but a major fundamental shift is happening at this moment. From emerging economies, we could see China at the front of green transformation, and China is now the biggest producer and the biggest market of renewable energy, and its total capacity annually is much bigger than the remaining world and both OECD and developing countries. In India, major transformation is happening, especially on the market side. OECD countries as well are acting. Japan is making significant progress in technological breakthroughs. The US has recently approved the Inflation Reduction Act. We have seen European Union also taking important measures. And new alliances are also developing in this process. The most recent coalition, the First Movers Coalition, which is an alliance of 50 global corporations and some OECD countries, is one important way. This has implication for Africa. It shows urgency. It shows that competition globally is going to be critical. We need to act, and the green divide is also a real risk despite the challenges we have. So this should be the first perspective we need to build on. The second perspective is Africa has a unique context. Africa has particular challenges. The reality is quite different. Africa is not one country. It's a very diverse continent. So the response and strategies is not going to be the same. One of the key constraints we observe is there is inadequacy of evidence in relation to what is happening on the ground, what are the challenges, what are the differences among these countries. I should stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That, of course, was Dr. Okobe, who's Senior Minister and Professor of Practice at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. And I'm not going to waste any time getting into things. We're going to be taking that conversation further now. And I'd like to introduce onto the stage Nasmira Mullah. She's Chief Sustainability Officer at 91, and her panel of guests as well.
I think this topic is something which you've already heard a lot of people explain the importance of. So I'm going to try and use this panel to get into some of the practicalities of it. I think the headlines we've covered in some of the opening remarks already. We know that new renewables are now our cheapest source of electricity. This was the case before the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the surge in gas prices has made renewables roughly 40% cheaper than gas, and a whole lot more cheaper than coal, new coal, in Europe at this point in time. So on the one hand, we have the need to decarbonize. If we talk about this 1.5 degree pathway the minister was talking about, if we have a hope of trying to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, we need the power system globally to decarbonize by a factor of 11% a year. carbon intensity from power generation needs to fall by 11% a year. On the other side, we have the real developmental challenges that Africa faces. We're going to get to South Africa's challenges. We all know the issues around load shedding, but we also have a need to allow Africa to develop, to use its resources. And how do we balance off these two things? We talked about common but differentiated responsibilities. It even has an acronym. Sustainability, most things have acronyms. So we have CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, which started off at the first COP in Rio, enshrined in Paris, but we're still figuring out what this actually means. So to discuss this topic, our panel brings together 4 quite different viewpoints. Up on the screen, we have Ambassador Ombeni Sefu. He, amongst quite a few other roles, is also Tanzania's permanent representative to the United Nations, and he's chair of the Tanzania Petroleum Development Company. To my left, we have the CEO of South Africa's electricity utility, Eskom, Andre de Ruyter. He also has 30 years' experience in the energy space globally and locally in South Africa. Next along, we have our guest from the United States, Mark Fiesel. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer. Americans like long titles, don't they? For Fuel Cell, which is a company specializing in manufacturing solutions for the power grid, but also in developing green hydrogen. And last up, we have our Standard Bank representative, but Stephen Barnes is the head of infrastructure and power at Standard Bank. So lots of practical experience on the ground. So to dive right into this, let's start with South Africa. Andre, unlike Africa, Dr. Akbai already made the point. South Africa accounts for a large portion of Africa's emissions. We have a very carbon-intensive electricity grid. 90% of the power generated in South Africa comes from coal. So the focus in South Africa is not only about building new capacity. We know that we have an energy availability factor problem. We have regular bouts of load shedding. 65% of capacity is our average at this point in time. The grid runs around there.
Slightly less.
Slightly less than that. So we have an energy availability factor. We also have a dirty grid. Is there an opportunity to try and solve both of these things simultaneously? You've been advocating for a rapid build-out in renewables for a while, so I think it would be really helpful for you to talk us through your thinking.
Thanks, Nazmira. Yeah, I think there's a narrative out there that this is a binary debate. This is coal versus renewables. This is carbon versus solar, and that's not the case at all. Eskom and hence South Africa will be a very substantial consumer of coal for a very long period of time to come. So the notion that somehow we will succumb to pressure from the global north to sterilize all of our natural resources, to satisfy pressure from international lenders is simply not substantiated by the facts. However, as Minister Creecy pointed out, we have a fleet of power stations that is very old, that is reaching retirement age, and in fact is, in a number of instances, beyond their retirement age. Now, mechanical equipment has a finite lifespan. You cannot keep on trying to use old power stations indefinitely. So there comes a time when you have to take investment decisions that will enable you to add new generation capacity to the grid. And to your point, given that we have energy insecurity in South Africa at the moment, given the fact that not only is renewable energy the cheapest, but also the quickest to deploy, and given that we have significant appetite from investors to make risk-based investments in renewable energy without support from government, without guarantees from government, which Eskom has recently demonstrated with its 2,000 megawatt first tranche of the land lease deal. I think we should see this as an opportunity to create an entirely new industry, to drive job creation, particularly in Mpumalanga, where we currently have not only dirty air, but we also have some of the highest unemployment rates in the country, particularly amongst youth and women. And we can therefore, if we act smartly, leverage concessional financing that is available, enable ourselves to pivot to a cleaner, greener future at the same time as growing our economy and creating jobs.
So the headlines would be, we're not going to shut down coal faster than useful life would suggest. We're going to use coal for some period of time. But the solution to our load shedding lies in renewables. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I would add one caveat to that, and that is that we need storage. So we need battery storage and we need additional pumped hydro storage. And Eskom is working on plans to enable exactly that.
Okay, let's move a bit broader. Let's talk about gas a little bit and the role of gas in Africa as a whole. So last year, prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the IEA published a report saying that we didn't need to develop any more greenfield gas. Thinking seems to have shifted a little bit over the course of the last 9 months. So, Ambassador Safir, let me bring you in at this point. Can you share with us your thoughts on how you see gas fitting into Africa's development?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you perfectly, and your great big pictures on the screen.
Thank you very much. How much time do you think I have?
Let's aim for like 2 or 3 minutes at this point.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. I'll skip quite a bit of what has already been said and just go to what I would consider a summary of what I wanted to say today. One is that Africa suffers from energy poverty. And SDG 7 clearly says that we need to develop accessible energy, adequate energy to everyone. So Africa, regardless of what is happening, what is being said, but Africa must do whatever it takes to tackle energy poverty and seek to meet SDG 7. And this can't wait. If you ask me, for Africa, the urgent and priority transition has to be from no energy at all to energy, from firewood and charcoal to gas to electricity. Doing so in itself will spare the forests that capture carbon. They will reduce carbon emissions from firewood and charcoal. It's true, Africa must strive to minimize its carbon footprint as it seeks to address energy poverty and seek to balance between the transition agenda with the even more urgent need to address energy poverty. So Africa's shift from fossil fuels to renewables must be very well balanced and staged and managed, and to be fair to Africa's effort to meet its development needs, and especially SDG 7. And here I see opportunities for private investment and for financial intermediation. But Africa must also continue to demand that rich countries meet their obligations, including financing transition and sharing technologies in line with commitments made under SDG 7. It is sad that according to UN statistics, international financial flows to developing countries for renewables have actually declined from $27.7 billion in 2017 to $14.3 billion in 2018 and to only $10.9 billion in 2019. A 44% decline in the last 2 years. Now you may wish to compare this with the amount spent to fund and supply the war in Ukraine. Follow the money and you will see where the priorities lie. So Africa must set its priorities. Africa has, right now, they are estimated $100 billion or so in new energy investments being considered on the continent. These need to be continued, include the vast amount of gas that have been discovered in Africa. And these have to be continued. Unfortunately, gas is considered an acceptable transition fuel. So I think Africa has to invest a lot in that. But also at COP27 and all other forums, Africa needs to firmly reject one-sided moratoriums that are completely ignoring the African continent and reality. Africa has to continue using fossil fuels, even as it seeks to reduce its carbon footprint and invest in alternative technologies. And the rest of the world must be prepared to share the technology and the financing to make it possible for Africa to make this transition. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Steve, I think we've heard from the ambassador the clear view that there's a need for Africa to be able to exploit its resources. What are your thoughts on the role of gas in the transition?
So, Nazmira, we see gas as a transition fuel. We've formally supported that view. And if you think about gas, its role is clearly broader than electricity, right? It plays a role in industrialization processes. It's a potential alternative clean cooking fuel, and so we see it playing an important role, through this transition period. We will finance gas in a responsible manner, in line with our transition our transition views. But we do see renewables as the backbone of the energy transition, and it's very clear that Africa's got deep renewable resources, wind, PV, geothermal, and hydro, and the latter two being baseload, right? And we should use those to the fullest extent possible. But very clearly, that baseload, source of energy is not available across all countries, and perversely, something like hydro is, impacted by climate change and drought and so on. And so we need to, have a balanced view on how we support the intermittency around renewables, and we think that gas can do that. Very clearly, there are emerging technologies, and we've heard a little bit about them earlier in the presentations. Hydrogen in particular, which has really exciting prospect to provide baseload, as well as battery storage. But neither of those two technologies are necessarily going to be available in the short to medium term at the scale and at the cost required to solve the baseload, mid-merit and peaking issues to support renewables. So we'll look to finance as a commercial bank, the various technologies that will ensure a considered and pragmatic transition around energy.
So as we think about this in the South African context, where we do have existing baseload, where would you see gas in SA?
Yeah, so I think firstly, look, gas is expensive in terms of financing the infrastructure. It's got long lead times associated with it. And so we need to think quite carefully in our planning around the role that it does play. But we think it can play, in particular, a mid-merit and peaking role. There's potential for it to play baseload, but I think the obvious place for it to play a role is around mid-merit and peaking solutions. So, for example, in the conversion of some of the the peaking plants that we have now at Creecy and Unkellig, those could have potential to be converted into combined cycle gas turbines, which would be a cleaner outcome than what we have currently. There's also the ability to, without investing too much in infrastructure, for example, utilize some of the existing gas infrastructure out of Mozambique through the the Romco line. That runs pretty close to some of those coal-fired those coal-fired power stations in Mpumalanga. And there's a potential, to kind of tie some of that resource into, those power stations, which, as we've heard earlier, are at the forefront of the decommissioning process. So, it's possible to use existing infrastructure. It's possible to think quite strategically about how we use gas, but we certainly think it's got an important role to play in the ecosystem.
I mean, I think the conclusion we reached is very much aligned to yours, that there's a role in terms of peaking power in South Africa, but it doesn't really have a role to play in terms of baseload. So if we move from the debate around gas into the concept of just transition, this is a term which has become widely used, and I think the understanding of exactly what it means is still being debated, certainly when it comes to the investment side of it. But it also can apply in two contexts. The one where I think the most debate is as a company decarbonizes, what it means. But I think there is also an element where just transition has meaning inter-country and between developed and emerging markets. We go from that macro viewpoint to the more micro. Andre, Eskom spent a lot of time talking about just transition, developing plans around this. Minister Creecy gave us some insight into that earlier. But can you talk us through some of the key elements of what you're doing there?
I think, first of all, let me agree with the ambassador. I think he's absolutely spot on, is that Africa should be assisted in its journey towards a lower carbon future. I think that makes sense. But in addition to the philosophical arguments that the ambassador makes, I think there's a very important economic argument. Mitigating a ton of carbon in South Africa is far, far cheaper than mitigating a ton of carbon in the European Union. Given that carbon is a global phenomenon, it makes a lot more sense redirecting funds away from decarbonizing Europe to assisting a country like South Africa to decarbonize. So I think we've got a compelling economic argument to make. Our position on the jet is that the energy transition is inevitable. You just cannot hold back this wave with your bare hands. It is going to happen. It will take place. And it's a bit like saying that, you still have nostalgic feelings for your fax machine. The world is moving very rapidly towards a decarbonized renewable energy base. What is not a given is making this transition a just one. And that has to be a deliberate attempt to address the very legitimate concerns of those who've invested in the coal value chain. And here I talk specifically about communities that have spent generations supporting companies like Eskom, like coal mining companies. And simply just putting a padlock on the gate and saying to a community like Komati, where there's a small hamlet, so long and thank you for all the hard work, and then leave them to their lot, is not acceptable, and it's not something that we can condone. So I think there needs to be a very deliberate attempt to ensure that we can repurpose, repower not only Komati but also subsequent power stations that approach retirement age. And you'll notice that we don't talk about decommissioning. Decommissioning comes with all sorts of accounting implications, so we're very careful to talk about retirement. But we also want to use retirement to give a notion of rebirth, a life after coal. And that's why we are retraining people at Komati to become solar and PV technicians so that we can offer them jobs in this new greener economy. We are investing in a manufacturing line to build microgrids, modular microgrids in repurposed shipping containers. We are, in addition to that, putting up 100 megawatts of solar, 40 to 70 megawatts of wind, thereby putting the lie to the notion that the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow in Mpumalanga. In fact, Mpumalanga is endowed with great renewable resources as well as a grid that is available for instantaneous connection. So I think Mpumalanga actually presents a fantastic investment opportunity that coincides very fortuitously with the objectives of the just energy transition.
Well, I grew up in Newcastle, which borders on Mpumalanga, so very glad to hear the focus on what were the 3 R's: retirement, retraining, and repurposing. Is that where we get to? So moving on from there, Mark, let me bring you into the discussion now. So we've been talking around a lot of how Africa and South Africa are viewing this critical issue, but one of the things we keep coming back to is the need for access to energy. And how can the technologies your company's working on help deal with some of the complexity we've been discussing this morning?
Sure, thank you. So we see access to energy as a basic human right, and today hundreds of millions of people don't have access to electricity. And clearly solar and storage are going to play some kind of role of bringing that access to electricity. But in addition to that, modular, scalable, repeatable, decentralized, and decarbonized baseload is an important element to that as well. And we see fuel cells as a unique mechanism in being able to deliver that. The second thing I would say is that today, 93% of Fortune 1000 companies have stated ESG goals. They use their ESG plans fundamentally to how and where they invest. And the ability to bring clean energy to these companies where they want to invest is vital in their decision making, and empowering those companies to be able to get clean energy from either a local national grid or from decentralized, decarbonized sources close to those facilities is extremely important for economic growth that also then touches on, of course, access to electricity issues. A third thing that we've talked about a little bit today is the national grid in general. Clearly a vital role to play in bringing grid-scale renewable energy together across the country to deliver that decarbonized energy to a wider array of people. But today we've also heard a lot about the persistence of coal, right? So Andre mentioned it, Minister Creecy have talked about the technical and societal issues associated with being able to transition away from coal. Decarbonization of coal is possible, but historically it's been challenging. Up to 20% of the output of electricity of a coal plant is required to go into the process and machinery necessary to decarbonize that. So it's kind of a big chunk off the top of your potential ability to deliver power to the grid. We have been developing some revolutionary technology that generates electricity at the same time that it can decarbonize the exhaust of coal and gas plants. So we see that as another mechanism to be able to keep important baseload generation sources on the grid in a decarbonized fashion. Finally, we talked a little bit about hydrogen today. And, Minister Creecy talked about some of the ideal circumstances that exist here in Africa for hydrogen. Access to beautiful sunshine and wind, access to water. Those are some of the real key elements to be able to create a green hydrogen hub environment. A real key part of that we've been focusing on is the electrolysis. So the electrolysis of water is something that's been going on for a long time. The mature technology that does that today, however, isn't extremely efficient. It's only about 70% efficient in the conversion of electricity into hydrogen. New technologies are coming to market right now that will move that efficiency up to 90 or 100%. So when we think about, leveraging this precious renewable commodities that we're building, that efficiency is really going to matter to create that hydrogen that can be used as a feedstock into green ammonia for easy transport or for agriculture or for use in transportation to decarbonize those elements or use as, once again, feedstock into steel and other assets, other segments of the economy. I would say the one common denominator of all those things is making sure that we have a real focus on local content and thinking about job creation that goes with this incredible opportunity to transition, whether it's the residential environment, the bulk grid environment, or the industrial environments.
So maybe going back to green hydrogen for a second. I've been fascinated to see that we are hearing from companies, whether that's in Europe or even South Africa, I was speaking to Sasol earlier this week, who are talking about the fact that the Inflation Reduction Act in the US has been game-changing around green hydrogen, has shifted the focus very much from Europe to the US, and the European companies are saying that Europe's going to need to play catch-up. What exactly has the IRA done that's actually shifted the game so much on hydrogen?
There's a couple different elements, and it is the IRA, but there's also other legislation that passed last year that worked together with the IRA. It was interesting. I was at the a Hydrogen Council event in Brussels immediately before coming here, and 6 months ago, I could have told you that most policymakers in the U.S. would have looked to Europe in terms of how far advanced they were above us, and it's amazing how quickly it changed overnight with the passage of various legislation. So kind of the following things come together, that there is a subsidy around the creation of hydrogen now, a subsidy that is going to make the creation of green hydrogen specifically. There's different variations around how much the subsidy is and what your carbon content is. It's going to make it much more competitive to a natural gas type story. And so second, there was extension of tax rebates and credits around technology that can make hydrogen. So example, electrolyzers and technology that can utilize hydrogen for power generation, such as fuel cells and other low carbon generation sources that can use hydrogen as a feedstock. The other thing that came into play actually began last year with a bipartisan infrastructure bill that got passed, and that was the creation of this idea of hydrogen hubs. So one of the biggest challenges has been how do you get the consumption of hydrogen to build at the same time production builds? Because without those two things being balanced, the market really can't move forward. And so the creation of these hubs was designed to incentivize local regional groups of companies and educational colleges and universities and public entities to work together to identify where and how hydrogen can be used and where and how it could be made. By bringing those things together at the same time and at once, you can move these markets forward.
So green hydrogen is an area that South Africa is beginning to explore. Namibia has done a lot of work on. But Steve, what are the other areas? I mean, we talk about the energy transition, the opportunities from that, but as Minister Creecy mentioned, there are wider opportunities here. What else should we be thinking about?
Yeah, so obviously energy transition is broader than just the electricity component, and so we do need to think about how we transition some of the perhaps harder to abate sectors. I think we're really giving some thought as a financial institution to how we do that. But there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit left in this market, particularly around addressing energy in particular, so electricity in particular. And there's obviously some focus there in terms of us as a financial institution doing or playing our part as part of that electricity transition process. And then, as I say, as you start to move into the harder to abate sectors, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But we clearly focused around how we can, for example, support cleaner transportation. Not necessarily straightforward. There's a lot of new technology in that space, and it's debatable at this stage as to which technology wins. Will it be LNG? Will it be hydrogen? Is it EV? And there's some unique challenges, I suppose, to Africa as a jurisdiction in terms of resolving transport. And transport's obviously a big component of emissions. And so, to be completely frank, as a commercial bank, it's quite difficult for us to take early stage tech risk, and so we typically look to support tech as it evolves. But we, as I say, clearly are looking for ways and means to play our part in the transition process more broadly than just electricity, and we'll continue to look for opportunities across our markets. So we're looking, but it's the obvious place for us right now is in electricity.
So on the electricity side in South Africa, if we think about which components need support, need some concessional finance or risk mitigation versus which elements can be financed cleanly themselves. From your earlier remarks, it does seem like generation is now something that we no longer need government guarantees on the back of. Or am I being too optimistic there?
I think that's slightly optimistic.
If you have corporate offtake,
yes, absolutely. So
you have clear corporate offtake. Do you need 100% corporate offtake, or can you do it at a 50% and they can sell the rest? How brave are you?
Yeah, so I think we are certainly evolving the way we look at that risk, right? And it is an evolutionary process, right? So long as we've got a single buyer model in South Africa, that's difficult, right? But if you've got a decentralized approach and you can face, corporate off-takers, for example, that's clearly a risk that we are looking at and we're taking at the moment. We were part of the financing of the Tronox facility, the decentralized energy for Tronox, which is kind of 200 megs at this stage. But that is a bilateral view on a corporate offtake. As the market evolves more into a merchant type market, I think the dynamics change completely. Then I think we not necessarily taking bilateral views on single off-takers, whether it's Eskom underpinned by government or corporates for that matter. You're starting to be able to wheel your electricity more broadly to multiple off-takers. And that allows us to take then a more nuanced credit view and to potentially support more. So right now, if you look at the way it's evolving, so it's moved from us supporting purely Eskom underpinned by government to the decentralized energy market, and that's thanks in large part to some of the regulatory changes that we've seen, and we envisage that the market now evolves into this more merchant type offering in due course.
And for that to happen, do you need further regulatory changes, or is it just time and experience?
I think it's a bit of both. But I would argue the latter is critically important. Time and experience in getting comfortable with the model, proving the concept. As I say, typically banks don't like to take early stage risk, but we need to, obviously, in order to move markets forward. And so we're cautious in how we approach it, but we think it's evolutionary and it will adapt over time.
Well, I think, the changes we saw in South Africa's regulatory landscape and Mark's explanation of the changes in the hydrogen landscape in the US show us how important the right regulatory environments are for all of these spaces.
Absolutely.
And, as we think about the rest of the continent, there's also an element of capacity building that's needed to support that. So maybe getting towards the end, the little red counter in front of me is getting to 5 minutes, so we're going to open up to Q&A, so please have your questions ready. But let me go back to both the ambassador and to Andre. And let's think about, as we think about enabling environments in order to support this transition, what are the key factors you're thinking about in Tanzania at this point? And then Andre, I'll come to you with the last question.
Thank you. For me, in Tanzania, and of course, speaking as somebody who's chairing the board of a gas and petroleum company, I think gas is good for Africa. And we should have the right environment to make sure that we use it, even as we build capacities in other areas. But the transition agenda is a very complex global problem. And as I say, the complexity arises from the need to scale up investment into renewable energy sources and sectors in order to transition to net zero, while at the same time ensuring universal and affordable energy to all. So the solution cannot be a moratorium, but the development of a mix, I would say you need a mix of political, economic, technological, financial, regulatory tools, you raise that, that's extremely important, to reduce the risk and to incentivize investment in renewable energy, while at the same time guaranteeing that SDG 7 will be implemented. That's how I would see it.
So if that's what we need on the larger scale, let's go back to the SA space. The generation space is increasingly being catered for with a private sector that's becoming more familiar with it. But Andre, what are the gaps? What are the areas that still are going to be more difficult to finance? We've had the grid being touched on in several discussions today. That is a clear weakness. Is that something we can involve the private sector more on? How does that work? You talked about storage earlier. What are the gaps in financing in South Africa?
Well, I think the first gap is that the banks need to start taking more risk. This addiction to national treasury guarantees, really, I don't understand it, because the energy sector, as far as I know, is the only one in the country where there are these 20-year guarantees. I've been in the manufacturing game for 30 years, and I've never gone to government and asked for a guarantee that all my products will be successfully sold and that I will earn a return. Now, I know that it's tied up with a single buyer model, and as soon as you open up the market, I think we should walk away from national treasury guarantees, also because government cannot afford it. So transmission is an interesting question, because it is a natural monopoly, and it can, with some difficulty, be opened up to the private sector, where there are existing nodes of generation and existing nodes of demand. And there are, for example, lines that are being built by the private sector between Montreal and New York. But Montreal is a large hydro sector, New York's a large consumer, obviously. When we look at the Northern Cape, which at this point in time is a very small generation sector, to build the transmission equivalent of a 6-lane highway, and initially having only one car per day driving up and down this highway, creates all sorts of challenges where, if a private sector investor were to finance that, then there would have to be significant cross-subsidy from other parts of the transmission grid. How do you justify that? How do you calculate that? How do you defend the levying of a duty, effectively, on existing transmission infrastructure to pay for an investor in new infrastructure? These are issues that we are grappling with. We haven't found a solution, but perhaps the banks can come up with a clever scheme to help us. Over to you.
Noted, Andre.
Any clever ideas, Steve?
I'll take the fifth at this stage on this one.
But I think that's an important challenge that's being posed, is if we're going to alleviate our energy crisis by building renewables in significant scale, yes, some of it will be in Mpumalanga, but a lot of it is going to end up in the Northern Cape. So how do we build that highway? And part of it will be timing the construction to when there's more than one car a day, but it's never going to be perfect, because you're going to need to evacuate the power as soon as it's built there. Thank you all. Thank you to my panel. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us online.
Thank you so much, Nazmira, for moderating a conversation that, of course, I'm sure had a lot of you lifting a whole lot of nuggets, even if we had some of your guests needing to summarize their perspectives for us this morning. This is not a binary debate that we're looking at. There is opportunity to create new industry by leveraging financing, by leveraging new technologies, but that we can't go this alone if we're looking to go far. And what we need is for developed countries to deliver on their commitments as well, but also for regulatory mechanisms to come to the fore, for them to play a more supportive role, and for banks, of course, to start taking a lot more risk as well. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say goodbye to our CNBC Africa audience this morning. It's been a pleasure having you join in on this morning's conversations.